This is the last in a series of special events put on for this summer's run of London Rare Book School courses. These events have explored a trove of niche and brilliant topics, from lost libraries to medieval ink to a tour of Mags Brothers' rare books and manuscripts. So it was my absolute pleasure to be asked to put something together which would tie in with one of this week's LLBS courses on the queer book, which is being led by Dr. Brooke Palmieri. I think several of you in the audience tonight might be attendees of that course, so welcome. I hope too that we've managed to reach out far and wide and take advantage of one of the benefits of pandemic event organising, which is to make talks like this accessible far beyond Senate House in London, where they'd usually be held. Tonight, we'll be hearing tales from two remarkable bookshops: Housemans at 5 Caledonian Road, which has been going since 1959, and PECKHAM on Maxford Road in SE15, one of the newest radical book spaces that London has to offer. And now I'm about to say something very earnest, but which I do really mean. Queer and radical solidarities and activism, spaces for community building and gathering, have felt so important over this past year and a bit. They've been much missed at various points and continue, frankly, in the current context to feel more vital than ever. I'm really grateful that we can hold space for these conversations and make these connections virtually, if not in person. And I can't wait to hear more from our three speakers: Nisha Murphy, Will Hecker and Peter Willis. I personally have been looking forward to this evening for ages, as these are Bookshops, projects and people I've been wanting to connect with for a long time. Nisha and Will speak first, followed by Peter, and then we'll move to a discussion and a Q&A at the end of the session. I'll introduce them properly in a second, but just a couple of housekeeping tips before that. We are in Zoom webinar mode, so only the speakers will be visible on your screen. As an audience member, you're automatically muted and your videos are off, but the chat will be open throughout the event, and I encourage you to make enthusiastic use of it as we go and to chip in and talk amongst yourselves. Please also use the Q&A function to post any questions that you have for any of our speakers. And finally, both the talks and the Q&A this evening are being recorded. So now we will turn to Nisha Murphy and Will Hecker, who are here to tell us more about a project called 5 Cali Road, 60 Years of Books and Activism. It's an oral history project documenting and creatively exploring the radical legacies of Houseman's Bookshop, and it's coordinated by On the Record, a non-profit cooperative who specialise in collaboratively produced oral history projects. So Nisha Murphy is a volunteer on the 5 Cali Road project and a queer activist based in London who is writing a PhD in gender studies. Her research is about queerness in the work of mid-20th century Irish writers, excavating a counter-archive of post-independence Ireland by listening for queer ghosts and other hauntings. Will Hecker is a documentary filmmaker and podcast creator with a particular interest in queer heritage. He's a producer of Queer Recollections, a podcast exploring contemporary queer British history, and a volunteer for the 5 Cali Road project. His latest film follows a group of women in Barcelona, all survivors of domestic violence, who use photography as a means of community building, reclamation, and self-expression. So without further ado, Nisha and Will, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And as Sarah said, my name's Will, and along with Nisha, we've been working with On the Record on this oral history project. You can see the name on the screen. It's called 5 Cali Road, 60 Years of Books and Activism. And as part of this project, we've been interviewing people whose lives have passed through 5 Cali Road, which is located in King's Cross in North London, for those that don't know. And it's been the home of Houseman's and also Peace House since 1959. So Houseman's is known as a radical and progressive bookshop, but What's less known and what the interviews that we've done have sort of confirmed and revealed is the building's very deep connections to British queer history and queer activist history. And as part of our work, we've been producing some creative responses to these interviews, including soundscapes that are going to be placed within the bookshop later this month. And I want to play you a short work in progress trailer of this soundscape to give you a little flavour, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the queer history of the shop.
Let me know if you can't hear this.
I think we're going. We're ready.
Yep.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Cali Road, to sum up, I suppose, is, a happy place.
Here is a space that won't be sold up, isn't going anywhere. It will take a wrecking ball to knock it down.
If you don't have any space, it's actually very difficult to organise things, to create strong movements.
Knowing that it's been there for that long, people discover it and think, oh, these ideas aren't new.
You can see that it's possible with quite simple and humble resources to be able to organise and do quite a lot of work.
I'm part of a long tradition just by being in the shop.
As a building, as a space.
It's ours.
And it's only when you actually have a physical space, then you can make things happen.
We're building on the legacy of that.
So that was a little trailer for some of the creative work, but I'm just going to fill in a little bit of the context and bring you back in history. So the Bookshop is named after Lawrence Houseman, who's a prolific writer and activist for peace, socialism, gender equality, and sexual liberation. He was a sponsor of the Peace Pledge Union, which was founded by his friend Dick Shepherd, but he also co-founded the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in 1907. And he was a member of the Order of the Sharonea, which is a secret society for homosexual men. In 1913, with Edward Carpenter, Magnus Hirschfeld, George Cecil Ives, and some others, Houseman founded the British Sexological Society, which was kind of an early gay rights group, predominantly interested in law reform around homosexuality. Houseman was the one to travel to Paris to deliver funds that he and his peers had raised to support Oscar Wilde after his release from prison. And Houseman also publicly defended The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall during its landmark obscenity trial in 1928. There's a letter in the archives at Bryn Mawr College that records Radcliffe Hall's thanks to Houseman. And Hall writes, "Too long has the public faced only half-truths, hiding its head in the sands of convention. The time has come for honest speaking." And I think this commitment to uplifting marginalized perspectives continues in the bookshop today.
So the Gay Liberation Front, or the GLF as it's better known, formed in 1970, about 50 years ago, and it had its first meeting in the LSE, which is a bit south of Houseman's. And the GLF, which was unlike other political gay networks before it, was really aimed at transforming society rather than trying to achieve equality within it. So they were focused on a whole plethora of issues, as well as wide-ranging cultural and social reform rather than simply law reform. So very soon after the GLF's formation, the GLF Office Collective started working at 5 Cali Road in the basement, which is below Houseman's. And you can see the address at the bottom of the demand leaflet on the left. As well as this, a lot of GLF subgroups met in the building. One of those subgroups was the group that published Come Together, which was GLF's periodical. And you can see the front cover of this on the image on the right. And this publication is really interesting because it gives a little hint of the movements that GLF were involved in. And if you look at the one of the subheadings at the top, it says GLF against the IRB, which covers a protest that the GLF attended in solidarity with the Trade Unions Congress, and that was against the Industrial Relations Bill. And this is obviously a precursor to what came later in the 80s, which was Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, which is a little bit more well known now. And then below that, you can see another subheading, which says Hey Man, and this is a challenge to gay men's misogyny within the gay liberation movement. And this also points to some of the internal conflicts within the movement over sexism. And what's also interesting is that last year, in 2020, they did renovations in the basement of the building, and they found all this wonderful graffiti that the Gay Liberation Front had left where their office once was, and you can read some of it there up on screen. It says, "Homosexuals unite" in the bottom left, "Gay Lib," and in the bottom right, sorry, and then on the top right slide, it says "the best Gay Liberation Front," I think in England, but I'm not sure because it's scratched out a little bit. On the next slide, you can see more of this graffiti from the basement here. And the GLF, partly because of its political intensity and all the disagreements that this produced, was quite short-lived. It only lasted until 1973, so 3 years in total. But one of its very important legacies was the huge number of groups and activists and networks that it produced. And it really went on to radically alter the course of modern British queer history. So the building itself carried on being a meeting space for gay activist groups. One example is the Gay Pride Week Committee, which organised early gay prides in the 70s. And another very important organisation, which Nisha's going to talk about, is Switchboard.
Yeah, so the GLF phone information service quickly became one of the most important aspects of the work of the Office Collective. So then in 1974, this reformed as London Gay Switchboard, renamed Lesbian and Gay Switchboard in the 1980s, and finally just Switchboard. And it operated from 5 Cali Road for almost 20 years and provided help and guidance to LGBTQ plus people from all over the UK. And then in the 90s, Switchboard moved out to their own purpose-built building. It's kind of hard to overstate the importance of Switchboard as a centre of LGBTQ activism and just a life-saving service for queer people, especially in these decades. We're talking about the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. I'm going to play a clip from one of our interviewees that kind of explains the kind of stories that they would hear over the phone.
I had a call from one lesbian who just lost her partner. The two of them had had a closeted relationship for decades. They both got husbands and they both got children. 5 days a week, they would meet for a few hours midday, and that had gone on for years and years and years. They kept that relationship completely secret. I said, "Am I the only person who knows that your partner's died?" And she said, "Oh yes, and you always will be."
So that was Mike Jackson, one of the founding members of Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, who you might know about from the 2015 film Pride. So Mike and Mark Ashton, another founding member of LGSM, actually met when Mark interviewed Mike for a volunteer role at Switchboard. And these are the notes from the interview that have been collected and kind of unearthed for the archive as part of this project. So I think this is an example of how, as well as providing this essential support and information to the callers, Switchboard brought together queer people from different scenes and different political backgrounds, and really became a hub for organising post-GLF, and all of that was at 5 Cali Road. And so moving on as well, Houseman's has been a part of the kind of wider story of queer publishing and censorship issues. This is a letter to Houseman's from Giovanni's Room, a bookshop in Philadelphia in the US, about a book order that had been sent to Houseman's but never arrived. And it later transpired that the books had been confiscated by customs because they were indecent, as they were LGBT subjects. 1 month previously, in April 1984, Gaze the Word Bookshop had been raided by customs and excise officers, resulting in the seizure of its imported books and criminal charges for the bookshop's directors. And in this case, with Houseman's, the trustees of Peace House decided not to fight the confiscation because they'd just come out of a court case involving Peace News, the peace movement magazine that was run from Peace House as well. But they did support the Defend the Gays the Word campaign. Houseman's as a bookshop has always been committed to stocking a wide range of perspectives, to being kind of non-sectarian in their stock and having clashing ideas on the shelves next to each other. And this kind of broad church approach meant that although it wasn't an explicitly queer space, Houseman's was one of the few spaces in London where you could find queer literature. One of our interviewees, Julian, who was part of the GLF in the 70s, as a teenager, he described kind of sitting in the back of the bookshop, reading anything he wanted, because he didn't have any money to actually buy books. And he said it was like having access to a radical gay library, and the staff were quite happy for him to just sit there. Another interviewee, Diana, emphasized how expensive it was to buy queer books, particularly as they mostly had to be imported from the US. And she described how she and her friends would kind of pool their money to buy these imported lesbian novels and sort of pass them around the squats. And then because of this kind of non-partisan approach that they still take to stocking the bookshop, Housmans found itself at the center of controversies about freedom of speech in feminist and queer circles during the 1980s feminist sex wars. So the bookshop stocked magazines like this one, Sex Positive magazine On Our Backs, whose title is a satirical reference to the anti-porn feminist magazine Off Our Backs, and which explored lesbian sexuality, including kink and BDSM. And I'm going to play a clip just from Diana explaining what the controversy was about.
There was a magazine back then called On Our Backs, which was a sex positive lesbian magazine, and it had like some BDSM stuff in it and stuff like that. That was another thing that started off really big arguments within the lesbian community at the time, as aping male and heterosexual stuff. For instance, if you were into bondage stuff, you know, and you either liked being tied up, shock horror, or even worse, you liked tying up your girlfriend for sex. Oh dear, these were terrible things. Yeah, because Houseman stocked On Our Backs. And so some of these feminists sort of were standing outside with placards and stuff and shouting at everybody that went in the door about them stocking On Our Backs. So I would sort of like stand in the door waving my copy at them, which really got stirred up. I couldn't resist. It was like, you know, nobody tells me what I can and can't read. That's what feminism is supposed to be about. And it was not like On Our Backs was anti-feminist or anti-lesbian. It was pro-everything. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, and that's some of the highlights we found in our interviews, and I guess to sum up, it's quite hard to sum up really the impact that 5 Cali Road and Houseman's Bookshop has had on queer British history, contemporary queer British history, and this social history more generally. But what really stands out in the interviews that we recorded is the importance of having this physical space to carry out these changes, you know, to print materials and to debate and to organise and to disagree. And this becomes kind of a bittersweet legacy in the context of all these queer spaces and these bookshops and community spaces becoming increasingly precarious and often closing down. But what does give us some hope is the fact that Houseman's is still here and still standing, and you can see a photo of it there on the screen. I just want to play a extract from the soundscape, which reflects on the legacy of the building and the bookshop.
As I said earlier, it was a safe place. You knew that you got behind once you got in that door. However wacky people might think your views were, this was a place where you would find support.
It was used as a refuge sometimes for overnight people. Yeah.
We had to deal with lots of young male prostitutes who were hanging around King's Cross and Euston Station and discovered the GLF office, and they would come and bend our ears for a while on what they were doing and why and so on. And they'd all be made a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and one would spend some time listening to their stories. And these kids were sort of homeless as well.
I would think people involved in Extinction Rebellion today, the Occupy movement that was, Black Lives Matter, I would think they too would find a home. They would find a place where they could go and not face, they know that they would be safe there. Houseman's was always a safe place. You know, it was a safe place for women who'd been attacked. It was a safe place for gay men or lesbians who had faced maybe being attacked on the street and could head for that place. You know how important that is? Or for somebody who is seeking asylum and has just seen the van going along on the street saying, "We're out to get you." Well, a place like that bookshop is a sanctuary.
Just before I stop speaking, I want to flag up two ways you can see more and engage more in the project. And the first of which is our website, which is launching really shortly, which is 5caliroad.org. And it's somewhere where you can explore the photos, the documents, some of the audio recordings, and also the creative responses to these pieces. And, you know, in this talk, we've just covered Houseman's and 5 Cali Road's connection to queer history. But, you know, also the building's been connected to the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the feminist movement, and so many other social movements. So there's loads to explore there. The second thing is a physical, in-person sound installation, which you've heard little snippets of. And that is currently being installed within the bookshop behind the shelves. And that's going to become public on the 26th of July, later this month. So if you are around Houseman's over the summer, please do pop in and take a look. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nisha and Will. That was absolutely brilliant. It's always so great and so moving to hear extracts from oral histories and to be able to share some of those really personal conversations and the sort of wonderful things that happen in that very close one-to-one oral history situation with a wider group of people. I'm also really pleased that this was such a timely thing, and that there is so much more to explore that we're going to be able to get our ears around very soon. Please do think of questions and anything you want to ask, and we'll move on to that towards the end. But now I want to welcome our next and final speaker of the evening, Peter Willis, who's going to talk to us about how he came to open his own bookshop. So Peter runs Books, a second-hand bookshop and zine shop in Peckham, South London. He's also one half of the publisher Studio Operative and is a PhD candidate at the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University. Peter.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to Nisha and Will. It's like such an amazing project. Just share my screen. Here we go. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to give a bit of a caveat, obviously, like, and to thank again, yeah, Nisha and Will, like, it's so important to have these kind of reflections on spaces that kind of bridge that gap between kind of inside and outside. And I kind of was thinking about it through them because I feel like the shop is essentially just me. And so I do get the sense that obviously I think about it every day, like every hour of every day, essentially. And that there is a sense that sometimes you kind of miss the forest for the trees to a certain extent. So that's kind of a caveat for this talk, that it might be very obviously personal to me. But also to kind of, yeah, underline how important kind of projects like the 5 Cali Road project are So I'm just going to kind of hopefully do a quick history of the shop. I'm kind of presuming that most people who are attending this probably haven't been. So I thought it would make sense to kind of go through how I ended up in this position, running a secondhand bookshop, because it wasn't really planned, to be honest. And so I thought I'd start with a kind of prehistory of the shop and how I've kind of come into doing stuff related to publishing and books. So the kind of two other projects that I've been doing pre-shop that I've kind of become sort of absorbed with it are that I've been involved in zines for a long time. I used to run a zine distro called Dead Trees and Die, which I started in 2004. And that's kind of been a thread that has run through everything that I've done basically since. Always been kind of producing zines, distributing zines, which has kind of informed a lot of the kind of approach that I've had to publishing, sort of from a DIY level. And then the other side, as Sarah mentioned, is that I'm one half of a publisher, Studio Operative, with Alice Lindsay, which started in 2012. So I moved to London in 2007 to go to Camberwell, and kind of after we graduated, me and Alice sort of started this press in 2012, ostensibly doing kind of illustration related publishing, but then expanded into doing more kind of artist books and then writing. We would describe ourselves as like a part-time publisher. So this is our website, Studio Operative. You can check out some of the stuff that we've published. And these are a couple of our latest titles. Around the same time, I also started to work at the ICA Bookshop. So it's kind of all of these things coming together really have kind of informed my approach to like working in a kind of gallery bookshop, and then also having this network through the publishing, and then also having this slightly different but kind of maybe related network through doing zine fairs and that kind of publishing. So all of these things are kind of like in the air. There's kind of a thread that connects all of this stuff, which is sort of amalgamated in the shop. So this is Books, the kind of inaugural Books iteration. So the way that it kind of came about, as I say, there wasn't really a plan to sort of start a secondhand bookshop, but it kind of came about related to the stuff we was doing with the studio, in that where we have our kind of printer, or our old studio where we used to have our printer, the people who ran that building also had some shop units, very small, and they were about 50 quid a week. So there was this idea at one point when they were advertising that maybe we could kind of have one of those units. We're both working, so maybe kind of a few days a week we could sell our books there and sell, you know, some of our friends who also were in the studio with us who are publishing things. My zine distro could be there, and then also having this kind of secondhand section. Because part of the stuff from working at the ICA is you're seeing all of this amazing stuff that's coming through, but a lot of it is not necessarily affordable. And obviously, you know, I love secondhand bookshops, but kind of the lack of new secondhand bookshops, or kind of the decline, I guess, of secondhand bookshops. I just thought we could have an element there also of selling secondhand books. And in the end, this never sort of materialized, but the idea was sort of there. And so this is in Camberwell Green, and they started up a Camberwell Sunday market, which was like a kind of arts and crafts and food market that ran every Sunday. And so I started, this is the first day here. I just had a wallpaper table, mainly books, like my books, some kind of friends who had left London, whose stuff I bought kind of with this idea in my head that maybe we would get this space. And it kind of just all went from there. So I was still working at the ICA. I was on kind of shift work, so I couldn't do every Sunday, but most Sundays I was there, and it just sort of I probably, if it was still going, I probably would just still be selling stuff at the market, to be honest. But it ran for about a year and a half, and then they stopped doing it. So by that point, I had a lot of stock, because as soon as I kind of, was there, standing there, people come up to you and they're like, oh, well, I've got books I can sell. Or, I kind of start to get this network. I started doing kind of getting called to odd house clearances and stuff. So I had quite a lot of stock, or what I thought at the time was a lot of stock. So I started to look for a different space. And in the end, I looked at quite a few different spaces over that summer, trying to find something that was affordable and that might work. And this is kind of what I managed to get. So this is kind of a built hut, which is up an alleyway just off Rye Lane. It was, I think the summer before I got it, it was used as an ice cream stall. So it was all kind of closed and then just had the window serving ice cream. And then I think briefly it was a florist after the summer. And then it was available. So the other spaces I'd seen were kind of like indoor markets, which were a bit too expensive, and some kind of built spaces within like a barbershop, and then they've built along one of the corridors. But they were just kind of too expensive. But this kind of seemed ideal also because it kind of bridged this gap between the market and kind of an indoor space. So I opened here, January, I think, of 2018. And you can see this was all of the stock that I had. I thought I had a lot, but it filled the shop exactly. And you'll kind of see how I kind of expanded as it kind of took over the space, basically. I should say here that this is kind of how it ran. Because I was still working at the ICA. Actually, by this point, I'd moved job, but it was the same kind of job, just working in a gallery bookshop. And it was all just rota. So on the Monday, I would get my rota, and then I'd be able to see which days I wasn't working. So which days I would be at the shop. And then I would just post this on Instagram. Literally, I'm open from midday on this day because I've got to go to dermatology at 10:45, or I'll be open late, in the summertime, I'd be open until it got dark around like 8 o'clock, or in the winter, probably till 4. And then also my constant kind of battle with the rain. That I would just check the weather. Okay, it's really raining today. There's no point in me opening, so I'm closed. I'll be open hopefully, Saturday. Hopefully tomorrow, we'll see. And I should say that this kind of approach obviously was necessity. I realized that I think this space was, it was £400 a month. I didn't have to pay any deposit. And I wasn't in any kind of contract. That was the only way really that I could manage to do it. I think I had about £600 that I'd made from the market. So I was kind of like, okay, if this really tanks, I can pay the rent for like a month and a half, and then I'll just go. And so literally I was there at the beginning, 4 days a week, basically every day that I wasn't at my other job. And that approach, when I was at the market, I went to New York, and kind of that was a real sort of inspiration. A couple of spaces there that were managing to kind of operate in this sort of semi-legit kind of not really way, because I think it's very easy to kind of get bogged down in this, I think we'll probably talk a lot about the lack of kind of space, physical space in London. And I kind of saw that, New York also is, if there's another kind of impossible place to kind of get a solid, legit kind of space that you can use, New York is the same situation as London. So if people are kind of carving out their own sort of section of, wherever to kind of do projects, then it can be done in London as well. You just have to try and find a way of doing it. And so that was a real kind of push to actually be like, okay, I can get a physical space of some sort, like let's just see what is available. And this kind of was perfect at the time. Well, I say perfect, but we'll get into that. So yeah, this is how it ran basically for almost 3 years up until this January. Kind of just expanded and expanded. I took over the alleyway. You can see the books up here. And this, I did try and kind of weatherproof it as much as I could, which is not happening. And so the reasons for leaving, I was looking for another space for, I don't know, probably over a year, just kind of seeing what was available. And then this is the last day, which was whenever the pre-Christmas lockdown was announced. I thought I would run all the way up until Christmas and then move, but obviously it was a little bit earlier than planned. And the kind of reason for 3 years and slightly losing the plot. Space, you can see I kind of like was drowning in stock. As it became kind of, people knew about it more, obviously more people knew that I was buying stuff. And also this area is being redeveloped at some point. It had already been sold, but I think my landlord who rented the yard, they're waiting for his lease to run out. And then, this is part of the whole station redevelopment. So also this thing in the back of your head that you're going to have to leave at some point. So thankfully I managed to kind of jump before I was pushed. So this is the new space, which I could be fully transparent. This was £400 a month. This is £600 a month. So it's like, it's more, but it's manageable. And it's an indoor space. And this is it kind of before we moved in, 2 rooms. And then this is my friend Felix who did the shelving for this first room, kind of doing it bit by bit as I can afford to pay for materials. And then this is the outside. So I think maybe we'll talk about this a bit, about this kind of relationship to space, because it really changes the kind of the vibe and the attitude, and even to a certain extent the kind of customers, people coming and looking at the stuff in terms of access, that being in an indoor space versus being in the market or being in the alleyway, and how that kind of changes the relationship. But this is the new space. It's still quite new. I've only been open there since April, and I'm doing regular hours Thursday to Sunday. And also kind of trying to, you can see the zine display here, making it a bit more equal in terms of the kind of self-published stuff that I'm selling, and then also the kind of secondhand stuff. I mean, that's pretty much it. I haven't really talked about the kind of like ethos of the place, but maybe that can kind of come out. I don't know, maybe that has come out, but maybe that can come out in some of the kind of discussion about what kind of stuff I sell, and the prices is the kind of the key thing, trying to keep everything as cheap as possible. Yeah, I guess that's it. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was like absolutely the ideal story of books that I wanted to hear. It was really, really great to see all those photos as well. Okay, so we have some time for discussion and questions. And I have questions myself from listening to all of you speak. But before I jump in and just start asking things that I want to know about, I wondered if any of you had burning questions that you'd like, either Nisha and Will, that you'd like to ask Peter, or Peter that you'd like to ask Nisha and Will. And also, if people in the audience are listening and have questions, do stick them in the Q&A.
I've something that I want to say. It's interesting that you said that you've part of the reason you've had to move is because the area is being redeveloped, and you know, King's Cross went under a redevelopment, and Houseman's was one of the buildings that was meant to be demolished as part of that, but they resisted that demolition, and there's a whole story about that in the stories that we're telling as well. But I'm wondering why you keep going with this despite all the pressures of everything. What's your motivation?
Sometimes I do ask myself this. I mean, the reality is that it's like something, you know, I've always kind of, even from doing the zine distro, doing the publisher, it's always been an extra thing to like my kind of paid work. And it's always been this thing of like, if I was just working at this place, I'd be bored out of my mind. I need like another thing to kind of direct some energy. And I mean, the long term, I said there isn't really ever been a kind of long-term plan for the shop because it's kind of just evolved. You know, I could have just done the market and then stopped. Or once the alleyway's gone, and maybe, you know, my landlord might put my rent up next year and then I'll have to kind of figure it out again. But I mean, ideally, I would like it to kind of become something that I could do full time, but also something that can be used more as like a community space. That maybe it isn't just, at the moment, it is just me doing like everything. And I can't do that forever. So it's like either the shop just goes, but I would much rather kind of it become a space that is a bit more open for other people to kind of be involved in and take it over essentially. The logistics of doing that are a bit weird because obviously it's never been planned to be kind of a kind of collectively run space. But I think especially now having like a physical space, that's a lot easier. You know, now you can just go and open the door and it's open. You don't have to pull everything out. And there's a lot more kind of possibility there, I think, for kind of using it in a much more like open way than I think has been possible before. Yeah. I mean, also like, as I'm sure like you guys have known, kind of doing this project, it's like meeting people and kind of, you know, like obviously I love books. It's like the ideal sort of thing for me to be doing, really. Going to people's houses, looking through all of their stuff, having conversations with people when they buy stuff, it's the bread and butter.
Okay, so we have some questions coming in to the chat. I wish that I could call on people individually and also see your faces, but I can't, so I'm just going to read out people's questions. This is one from Clea for Nisha and or Will. Where are the oral histories from the 5 Cali Road project going to be held for long-term access?
At the Bishopsgate Institute in London, yeah. On the Record are working in partnership with Bishopsgate to keep them keep them for researchers and archivists.
Cool. Do you know when they're going to be like accessioned and available? Because I, for one, definitely want to listen to them.
I don't. I'm sorry. I don't know exactly. I can find out for you.
And this is a question for Peter, again from Clea. What makes books queer and radical? If queer and radical is something that you would identify with or not, I am not sure.
Yeah, I mean, like particularly for this talk, I've thought about that a lot, because I think from my kind of approach to it, I always just kind of assumed that the kind of like radical aspect of it is obvious, but obviously like it really isn't. I know, I mean, some days I'm kind of thinking like there isn't really any difference between my shop and any other kind of secondhand shop. I think what I'm trying to do, the kind of radicality of it isn't just reflected in the stock. Obviously, the stock that I have is also kind of is an extension of my own interests to a certain extent. And I don't kind of advertise that I buy stuff. So the majority of people who's when I do house clearances, it's often word of mouth. So it comes through people who kind of know the kind of things that I stock. But the kind of what I consider, I don't know, this is it, radical. My kind of conception of it is that I'm trying to just make things as affordable as possible. Kind of cheap books, cheap, good books, basically, which doesn't seem really to be that kind of a radical thing. But particularly kind of in the area where I'm in, like, there doesn't need to be like an explicitly kind of radical info shop like we have 56A, like up the road. And we don't need a kind of independent bookshop. We have Review down the road. Like there's a lot kind of in there who sell, you know, new great books, but for, you know, £10 each, which for a lot of people is not actually affordable. So there's kind of that side of it, as well as then the stock, the focus of the stock, although obviously that is going to be a lot more general because I'm trying to kind of provide to a certain extent what the community wants in terms of, there's this balance between kind of my interests so that it's actually kind of still interesting for me to kind of put my energy into this, but also like being something that can be used by a wider community. And I think also that's the kind of two sides of the shop, like secondhand books, cheap, more general kind of stock, but then also the zines, which are a lot more kind of politically like explicit, I guess. And that's kind of an interesting relationship in terms of you get certain people who come in because you're selling, you know, like something that came out a couple of years ago for a couple of quid, and then they'll engage more with the kind of the more self-published and more kind of literally radical like material. Yeah. And then also this kind of extension of using the space now a bit more to run events and kind of workshops, and it being a space that different groups can kind of use to organize things, which obviously down the alleyway couldn't really do as much of that.
That idea of space and being able to open it up to different community groups is really, really key. And I think we see that a lot in, I mean, certainly in the Houseman stories that you've been sharing, but also in what you mentioned about Gaze the Word and LGSM and that idea of the bookshop as a space. We've got a couple of questions related to that, which are kind of for all of you. So Stephen asks, whether you might each share some thoughts about the difference between physical objects, books and spaces rather than digital, and how isolation and lockdown over the past year might have changed your opinions or thoughts on that. And Layla is asking, it would be great to hear more about your thoughts about the role of radical bookshops as community spaces, especially in the face of encroaching gentrification, which is definitely a theme that's been coming up and kind of interestingly joining both of your talks together, I think. So do you guys have thoughts about the community spaces of either Housemans or books and the kind of physical digital divide that's been happening over the past year, and maybe how that's affected the project as well, because that must have been quite a big thing for you, Nisha, and Will.
It's something I thought about a lot because, you know, we're doing this project about 5 Cali Road. It's a physical space, but we've done almost the entire project online, we've done all the interviews remotely. You know, some of us on the project haven't been to the shop even. And so in that context, it's quite interesting. It shows you what you can do online, but also, you know, I've got a personal opinion on this. We're all on an online call at the moment, but I think there's a part of our brain that knows that this isn't, you know, we're not next to each other, and it's a bit tiring for us to be talking through this digital format. So for me, physical space is really, really important, and being able to meet physically is really, really important, and interact and react to people's body language. And that relates to the other question as well about community spaces. I don't, you know, that are obviously online movements and a lot can be achieved online, but there's a real value in meeting up in person and sharing ideas and organising in person and showing your face. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just second that, I think. And I think it's something that came through. It was impossible to avoid in the interviews, like that question. So we did spend a lot of time thinking about the physical space because we were interviewing remotely. And like, it was really interesting to talk to like the staff who currently work in the bookshop who have been interviewed, you know, as part of the project, who are like kind of all at home working remotely and going into the shop to mail things out, like when we spoke to them. And they were all sort of marinating these ideas about like what can we do when we're allowed to be in a room together again, because this craving for it has become, and for physical books and for like being able to browse a shelf and see what's next to, you know, different books on the shelves, and kind of that physical way of browsing that like generates ideas and connections in a way that's like absolutely key to a bookshop, right? Like you can't really manufacture that online. So yeah, I'm personally really excited to see what like the folks running Houseman's do when they can have events and stuff again in person, because they've been doing amazing stuff online. But I know that they're kind of like itching to get people in a room again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all missed bookshops in a big way. Peter, did you have any thoughts about that?
I guess, yeah, I was just thinking, because obviously it's a bit different for me, because there wasn't really, like during lockdown, the shop was closed and I kind of didn't, there wasn't really any continuity with that. But what I did do was that I kind of, you know, a lot of my regulars who I have these kind of relationships with are like completely off grid. So I did kind of lose contact with a lot of people during the kind of lockdown who would come in like every week for a catch up, or kind of, you know, some people, they come and they sell me stuff and I'm quite a, you know, regular source of income for them to a certain extent. And kind of that like awareness of people who are just completely like falling through the gaps, who don't have a phone, don't have any online kind of, that really kind of was, I don't know, it's just like that's something that I was thinking about a lot during the whole period. And then kind of sort of hoping that they kind of appear at the other side, you know, like re-emerge, because I've got no way of kind of contacting people. But I guess the kind of other side of that is that I did manage to connect a lot more with other people who I maybe wouldn't have connected with at the shop because of, I don't know, it's somehow related to the space as kind of a place of like commerce or whatever, that you don't want to spend too much time. I try and make the shop as much as possible a space where people can just hang out and you don't have to buy stuff. But obviously there is that, always going to be that kind of tension. And so I do feel like I did connect with some other regulars who I maybe wouldn't have spoken to that much in the space of the shop, who were kind of emailing me and like checking up on each other and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know, a bit rambling, sorry.
No, that's amazing though. So Books has created its own community in that sense. I mean, you with your regulars and then people that come into the shop, connecting with each other in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to without the shop. I was really struck in the in the extracts that you played from the 5 Cali Road project, some of those words that were coming up over and over again: safety, sanctuary, support, refuge. I wanted to know from all of you really whether there were any other kind of adjectives that people were using a lot to describe the space of the shop. And also, Peter, like, what words would you use to describe books, or what do you hope people would use to describe books?
I seem to remember people using the word musty a lot to describe husbands in the 70s and 80s. Always with a very loving kind of, yeah, it was chaos, but it was like, it was cozy. Yeah, that kind of sensory experience of you know, being in a building that's kind of being run on a shoestring, and you know, I think is recognizable in a lot of those kind of community and activist spaces. It doesn't, yeah, that's one thing that stands out for me. What about you all?
I mean, it's related to this idea of safety, but the idea of home came up a lot. And, you know, Houseman's is a commercial space, it's a bookshop, but at the same time, you could go in there and not spend any money, and you could go in there and just chat to people. And they you know, rented out their meeting spaces often for free. So, you know, there's a value in that, in having a space, an indoor space maybe, where you're not pressured to spend money, which is increasingly rare, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it's been, yeah, I've kind of struggled with this a bit, moving to the new space in terms of like approachability and like trying to make something that's not intimidating. Because I think there are kind of a lot of spaces, particularly if they are, yeah, really kind of obviously commercial spaces, that are quite intimidating, or you feel some kind of obligation to buy something, or, you know, that you need to know already what you're kind of after. And I think secondhand bookshops in general kind of lend themselves to spending time within that space that can kind of reduce that feeling, because there's this idea that you don't need to know what you want when you come in, because it's a, you know, you don't know what's there. Like, that's the whole point, is that you'll spend some time finding things. It's been difficult, obviously, because I have a very small shop, and it kind of was more COVID safe when I was at the alleyway, because it's outdoors. So having that kind of bridging that gap of somewhere where you can spend a bit of time and feel at ease, while obviously still limiting the amount of people who are in the space, has been tricky. But hopefully, kind of, yeah, if things ever become a bit easier, just having like an area where people can sit down, or just, you know, I've got like a bench that I have outside where people can just like hang out, basically. Yeah.
That's so nice. A lot of what you're saying, and what you were saying before about the kind of digital divide, like the people that are your regulars that don't have a phone, that aren't online, so you were going to lose track of them. It reminds me a lot of how people use public libraries in a way, that kind of need to come together and find community, and for it to be free and to be able to browse. It's a really interesting kind of crossover. We just have one more question for Nisha and Will, which is, could you say a little bit more about how Houseman's resisted the King's Cross redevelopment?
Yeah, so I guess what was key in this is that they own the building. Well, the bookshop doesn't own the building, but the Peace News trustees own the building, and that was because it was a vicar called Tom Willis was left a bequest in the 50s and gave the money to Peace News to buy a space, and so they've had ownership of the space since they moved there, and actually moved out of the first premises that the bookshop was in, which was on Shaftesbury Avenue. They had to move out of there after 3 years because the lease was up with Westminster Council, and they couldn't afford to renew it, or all the alternatives kind of in the same area were too expensive. So it was actually kind of it's kind of depressing, but it is just needing to own the property was what allowed them to then resist being demolished, and kind of galvanized a campaign on Cali Road, that stretch around number 5 that is kind of noticeably still older buildings. Was kind of, Houseman's was at the center of that campaign to save it because they couldn't be forced out. And there are some creative pieces that kind of respond to that idea that'll be up on the website. And so, you can kind of get a sense of the archive material that we found relating to that.
Brilliant, yeah.
I would just add to that as well that I think something I've reflected on a lot from doing these interviews is how the story of Houseman's is kind of the story of how London and King's Cross has changed so much in the last 60 years, and you can kind of see it as a little bit of an outpost in the area because it's totally changed, really.
Yeah, King's Cross, I mean, it's so different, and Peckham are both so different. Yeah. Okay, so a couple of questions for Peter now. Just to say, by the way, it's 4 minutes past 7, and we did say this could run till 7:15. So as there are still questions, I will just keep asking. Obviously, people can feel free to leave if they have other things they need to be doing. So a couple of questions for Peter. One, attendee is asking, do you have any tips for people who want to start a bookstore but lack the capital to do so? And this is a totally unrelated question, but will you be creating a books archive for Bishopsgate, like the 5 Cali Road project?
I think it's a bit too early for that. Let's wait until I get as old as Houseman's. I mean, this is it. For starting, I don't have any advice for starting a bookshop if you don't have the money, because I couldn't. If I had the idea to start a secondhand bookshop and I wanted to just get a shop space, it would have never happened because I don't have that money. And I mean, I've been doing it now for 5 years, and it's still not I don't get any money from it. Do you know what I mean? It's it makes money, but it's kind of gone from £25 a day at the market to then when I moved to the alleyway, I knew, okay, it's £100 a week. I have to make £25 each day to pay the rent. And now I have to pay, I'm open 4 days. I have to make £600 a month to pay the rent. It's kind of, that's how I've managed to get into this position, is kind of doing the very kind of cheap £25 a day for a year and a half, and then using that money to then move to the other space for 3 years, and then using the money. It's kind of been a slow build, which is why I talk about it not kind of being planned in this way. Because I think if I had tried to plan it or think, oh, I want to open a physical shop like I have now, it's still kind of insane that I've ended up in this position, because it just wouldn't have been feasible. And I mean, it's like you say, Houseman's is there because they own the building. It's there's so many other places that aren't there because they didn't own the building. Or I don't know what the answer is. Try and find someone who's got money who likes bookshops, because there are people around who maybe would want to buy you a building. But other than that, I mean, you have to. I mean, I'm in the privileged position of I don't have to rely on the shop to pay my rent because I've always worked elsewhere. And now, thankfully, I've got funding to do this PhD. So that's why I can keep regular hours at the shop and still get money to pay my normal rent and pay for my, for me to live. So, I don't know. There's not an easy answer, to be honest. You just have to kind of like stick with it.
I think,
or maybe be prepared to not make money, basically, is the other side of it.
I think everyone listening to your talk will really appreciate your transparency about the costs involved and the money and your kind of outgoings, and that stuff doesn't often get talked about. Okay, so a couple of questions now, back to Will and Nisha. Rosen is asking, could you talk more about your process of conducting the oral histories? How did you structure the sessions? How did you get in contact with people? And how did you edit the oral histories that you gathered? And another question about the 5 Cali Road project. Did you get a sense of any connections between Housemans and other radical bookshops that are being mapped now through kind of similar projects? Are you aware of broader efforts to join the dots between the histories and the constellations of people around bookshops like Housemans, or are they pretty dispersed in pockets? This is from Lucy, and she says, so much falls through the cracks when physical spaces are lost, which, yeah, absolutely, that's a really good point.
Oh, I'll start. To answer the question about process, yeah, we set up remote interviews. So we would send microphones and headphones to the people we wanted to interview, and often the people we were interviewing were quite old or older, and so required some technical help, really, with the microphones. Some of them weren't able to use the microphones. We ended up having to record the conversations through the telephone. And in terms of how we got in contact with them, through a whole range of means, reached out to various networks. There's the GLF has reformed, in fact, for its 50th anniversary, the surviving members of which, and so we got in contact with them. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Nisha.
Yeah, I guess the sessions were kind of structured totally depending on who we were interviewing. It was always kind of 2 volunteers, one person looking after the tech mostly, and somebody else kind of actually conducting the interview. And so we just sort of took what we already knew about the person we were interviewing and kind of constructed plans for sort of questions we wanted to ask them, but it was fairly flexible and specific to the person. So some people we have hours of audio, and then some people are kind of just one interview for like an hour-ish. So we've got this really wide range of different kind of audio types, and then they were all transcribed, and we just spent, and particularly Rosa, the project coordinator, spent forever kind of combing through them and coding them, and eventually this is going to culminate in the sound installation, which will be in the bookshop.
And I think there's a second question as well now about the connections between different radical bookshops. There was something called the Federation of Radical Bookshops back in the 80s, and that was a time where every major town in the UK had a radical bookshop, and that faded away, sadly, because a lot of these places just closed down along with the sort of general decline of bookshops. But there's something at the moment, I think, it was called the Federation of Radical Bookshops, and now there's something called the Alliance of Radical Bookshops that's recently set up. And I don't know, maybe Peter knows more about this than me, but I think they're trying to pick up the work that organisation used to do. And in terms of physical spaces closing down, I think that's why this project is so important, because we're documenting this history. A lot of the people we interviewed, as I said before, are older now. If you did this project in 10 years' time, you might lose a lot of those stories. So it's really vital to do this work as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think the only other project that comes to mind for me is Islington Pride are doing a really interesting kind of plaque project to mark queer spaces in Islington. And like Housmans obviously has a plaque, and places like Sister Right Bookshop, which was doesn't exist anymore, but was a lesbian feminist bookshop. Places like that are kind of being mapped. I think they've made a kind of trail that you can do, and you can see the plaques around, which is really, really, again, just completely vital to recognize how much queer history is actually, in these nondescript buildings or unmarked.
Yeah, absolutely. There was so much in your talk, especially to do with Operation Tiger and the Defending Goes the Word campaign. Things that I'm really, really interested in, but are like weirdly under-examined in queer history and queer book history. So there's definitely scope for lots and lots of projects and capturing and oral histories and research and writing, hopefully. I'm just going to ask one more question to both of you because it's short and snappy and it's in the Q&A box already. So this is from Alice. Any idea about the average transaction value at each shop? That sounds extremely technical and I don't know what that means, but I'm going to hand that over to you.
I guess it means like the average amount of money people spend, right?
All right, yeah. You're right, yeah.
I think for me, it's probably, I don't know, probably maybe £5, maybe under. 3 books, £5.
I don't know about Housmans. Have you any idea? Well, I haven't a clue.
No, I can't answer that question with any accuracy. I could guess, but I feel like that would be unethical.
Okay.
I just wanted to say about the radical bookshops. There is, the Alliance of Radical Bookshops. I think they've actually got quite a lot of new members recently. Places like Shelf Life in Cardiff, I think, and like Categories up in Scotland. There are kind of a lot of newer kind of bookshops that are joining that network. I'm not a member, just refused, so we shouldn't say anything else. But I think that there is kind of a sort of resurgence. And I just also wanted to say 2 things. There's a really good project by Dave Cope, Left on the Shelf, which has a lot of like the history of radical bookshops in the UK, all over the UK, and is a really good kind of mapping of historically and also kind of radical bookshops that are newer radical bookshops or stuff that's still going today. And also that I felt that I was too negative on the last question about how to open a bookshop if you don't have any money, that things are possible, and that like hopefully the shop is an example that things are possible. It's not as bad as, I mean, it is as bad as we all know it is, but like we have to keep the faith that you can kind of carve these spaces out of a city that really doesn't want you to carve these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. And we've got to try, right? We've got to have hope. That's probably a good note to end on, unless there are any other burning questions or remarks that people would like to make. So I think with that, we'll bring tonight to a close. In pre-COVID times, this would be the moment where we all shuffle awkwardly out and have some complimentary warm white wine, but we can't do that. And I think there's some kind of sporting activity happening tonight, maybe, I don't know, people are interested in that. So I just wanted to end by thanking each of you, Nisha Murphy, Will Hecker and Peter Willis. Thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. I'd also like to thank Ellie Hardy, at the Institute of English Studies for sterling behind the scenes support as ever. And to thank everybody who came and listened and asked excellent questions. So thanks all, and enjoy your evening and the football if you are of that persuasion.